In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front reached a point where both Germany and the Soviet Union treated time as a measurable resource. After the winter battles of 1942 to 1943, German forces had stabilized a long front line, but their operational freedom was constrained by losses in trained manpower, tanks, and aircrew, and by the need to defend multiple threatened sectors. The Soviet Union had absorbed those same winter campaigns while expanding artillery stocks, repairing and refitting armoured formations, and building deeper reserves. By late spring, the front around Kursk formed a salient projecting westward, with German-held Oral to the north and Belgorod-Kharkov to the south. This geography offered an apparent opportunity for a double envelopment, but it also made the direction of any major German attack unusually predictable. For the German High Command, the salient became the basis of Operation Citadel, a planned offensive intended to shorten the front, destroy Soviet operational reserves, and recover initiative before the Soviet summer campaigns could begin. In the northern pincer, the main striking force was the German Ninth Army under Generaloberst Walter Model, attacking south from the Ural region. Opposing it was Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front, with its principal defensive burden in the first days falling on formations such as the 13th Army in the Poneri sector. Both sides understood that the north would be a test of whether a heavily prepared defence could be broken by concentrated armour and engineer support under close artillery and air coordination, and the Soviet position rested on a different assumption than in earlier phases of the war, that defence could be planned in layers rather than improvised at the last moment. Central front defences were organised in belts with successive trench systems, strong points built into villages and wood lines, and dense minefields designed to slow armoured movement into predictable lanes. Anti-tank guns, infantry anti-tank teams, and field artillery were distributed not only at the front edge, but behind it, to sustain fire after the first line was penetrated. This approach did not depend on holding a single trench. It depended on delaying German tempo, forcing repeated deployments under fire, and consuming bridging, breaching and recovery capacity faster than it could be replaced. Within that framework, Poneri Station and the fortified settlement around it gained importance beyond its size. It lay on a rail and road corridor north of Kursk, near terrain that channels movement between fields, shallow ravines, and built-up positions. For the attacker, a capture of Poneri promised a step toward operational depth, a local rupture that could open routes toward Olkovatka and the heights covering approaches to Kursk. For the defender, it offered a natural anchor for a knot defence, a place where rail embankments, buildings, and prepared positions could be integrated into interlocking fire zones and where reserves could move on interior lines. The immediate human dimension was shaped by that preparation. The population in and around Poneri faced evacuation, requisitioning of labour, and the rapid transformation of homes and public buildings into firing positions, aid stations, and supply points. Soviet soldiers entering the sector encountered an environment already altered for battle. Marked mine lanes, camouflage, pre-registered artillery fires, and instructions that assumed communication would break down and positions would change hands. German formations assembling for the assault faced a different set of constraints. The need to breach mined defensive belts under observation, maintain fuel and ammunition flow along limited road networks, and keep tanks operable despite expected losses to mines and mechanical strain. By early July, the strategic problem narrowed into a concrete question that both commands recognised. Could Model's 9th Army force a breakthrough in the northern shoulder of the salient quickly enough to meet the southern pincer? Or would Rokossovsky's layered defences convert the offensive into a sequence of short, costly advances that consumed the available striking power? In that question, Poneri was not a side episode. It was one of the places where the northern offensive would either gain momentum or begin to stall, and where units such as the Soviet 307th Rifle Division would measure their task not in kilometers gained, but in hours and days denied to the attacker. Before dawn, on July 5, 1943, the northern wing of Operation Citadel opened with a deliberate attempt to compress Soviet reaction time. German Ninth Army initiated the attack with a concentrated artillery preparation, followed by infantry and engineer detachments tasked with cutting lanes through minefields and wire so armoured groups could move into the first defensive belt. The method reflected Model's assessment that the decisive constraint was not Soviet strength in a single trench line, but the depth and density of prepared obstacles that could slow vehicles and expose them to anti-tank fire before a breakthrough could develop. The German assault was organised around several core-level thrusts rather than a single narrow spearhead. Panzer divisions, including 2nd Panzer Division and 9th Panzer Division, were committed as part of the armoured effort supporting the penetration, while multiple infantry divisions advanced to widen the corridor and secure flanks. Assault guns and specialised engineer assets were used to keep the movement from stalling at the first mine belts. Heavy anti-tank vehicles, including Ferdinand tank destroyers deployed in the 9th Army sector, were intended to provide long-range fire against Soviet guns and tanks once lanes were opened, but their movement and recovery capacity were still constrained by mines, soft ground, and the need for cleared routes. On the Soviet side, Central Front treated the opening day less as a surprise to be absorbed than as a forecast event to be managed. Rokossovsky's headquarters had placed the forward armies on alert, with artillery fire plans tied to likely German assembly areas and breach points. In the immediate defensive zone north of Kursk, 13th Army held the sector that covered approaches toward Poneri and Olkovatka. Units in the first belt were expected to yield ground selectively rather than remain fixed at the forward edge, while anti-tank guns and infantry strongpoints aimed to force German armour into predictable lanes created by mines and demolished crossings. Soviet artillery and air support were used to target breach sites, engineer groups, and road junctions, where German columns compressed and became visible. The first day produced movement, but not the operational opening the German plan required. German forward detachments gained footholds in parts of the Soviet forward zone, but progress was repeatedly interrupted by mine strikes, the need to clear new lanes under fire, and Soviet local counterattacks against exposed spearheads. Soviet infantry, supported by anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions and by artillery concentrations on cleared lanes, focused on slowing the tempo rather than holding every forward village. This forced German commanders to deploy reserves earlier than planned, simply to maintain forward momentum and protect flanks. By July 6th, the battle's geography began to narrow toward a few key corridors. The rail line and road network around Poneri station increasingly mattered because they provided the most direct routes through the defensive belts toward higher ground further south. German forces pushed to bring the Poneri area within artillery range and to secure the approaches needed for an assault on the fortified settlement itself. Soviet defenders, including formations that would soon center on the 307th Rifle Division's positions in and around Poneri, reinforced strongpoints, shifted anti-tank guns to cover likely breach exits, and prepared immediate counterattack groupings behind the first belt. The opening phase therefore set the terms of the later fighting. The German 9th Army had achieved limited penetrations into the outer defences, but it had not broken the layered system or created free manoeuvre space for armour. Central Front had lost forward ground in places, but it had preserved its core method, forcing the attacker to spend time and equipment on each belt, and shaping the next engagement around prepared positions where the rail station and surrounding buildings could be turned into a fixed point of defence. By the evening of July 6th, Poneri was no longer a map reference. It was emerging as the next critical objective where the northern offensive would either accelerate or begin to stall. Operation Citadel was planned as a time-limited offensive with geographically defined objectives. In the northern pincer, Model's Ninth Army was not tasked with capturing Kursk on its own. Its operational purpose was to break through Central Front's defences, seize the intermediate terrain lines that controlled the road network south of Oral, and create conditions for a junction with the southern pincer moving north from the Belgorod area. In German planning, the decisive effect was expected to come from the destruction of Soviet reserves in the salient, not merely from taking individual settlements. Poneri mattered because it sat on one of the few direct approaches that could support continued southward advance toward the Olkovatka area and the heights that dominated subsequent routes. The German approach combined doctrine developed in earlier campaigns with adaptations forced by the 1943 situation. The offensive plan relied on narrow penetration corridors opened by engineers and mine-clearing detachments, followed by armoured groupings, intended to exploit beyond the first defensive belt. This required a supply rhythm that 1943 conditions made difficult to sustain. Fuel consumption was high. Recovery vehicles and spare parts were limited relative to 1941 standards, and the road network north of Kursk was not designed for continuous heavy traffic under artillery and air attack. The northern pincer also faced a constraint specific to its mission. Much of its striking power had to be used to keep the breach corridor open, because flanks were threatened by Soviet strongpoints designed to survive initial bombardment and continue firing into cleared lanes. In this context, the assignment of formations such as 2nd Panzer Division and 9th Panzer Division to the Poneri direction reflected a concrete planning logic. Panzer divisions could provide a mobile reserve to stabilize stalled advances, concentrate fire against identified anti-tank nests, and support infantry assaults on fortified villages when pure maneuver was blocked. Infantry divisions, assault gun units, and attached engineer battalions were expected to do much of the initial work, reducing trench systems, clearing mines, and capturing strong points that controlled road junctions and rail embankments. German heavy anti-tank vehicles, including Ferdinand tank destroyers in the 9th Army sector, were intended to suppress Soviet guns at longer ranges, but their operational value depended on cleared routes and on the availability of recovery support if immobilized by mines or mechanical failure. Soviet planning for the Kursk defensive battle was shaped by a different calculation: that a predictable German offensive could be met by a defense designed to trade space for time while preserving counteroffensive capability. Central Front prepared defenses in multiple belts, not as separate positions, but as a connected system with planned fallbacks, pre-registered artillery fires, and reserves positioned to seal penetrations. Instead of treating minefields as static barriers, Soviet engineers used them to channel German vehicles into narrow lanes where anti-tank guns, mortars, and artillery could concentrate fire. The objective at the tactical level was often not to prevent entry into the first belt, but to prevent transition from penetration to exploitation. The Poneri sector fit this Soviet concept because it offered a built-up environment that could be converted into layered strongpoints. Defensive planning integrated the station area, adjacent villages, and rail embankments into mutually supporting positions with overlapping fields of fire. Rifle divisions assigned to hold the sector, including the 307th Rifle Division, were structured to occupy strongpoints in depth while keeping local reserves for immediate counterattacks against any German units that broke into the settlement. Soviet anti-tank assets in the area were not limited to single weapon types. Standard anti-tank guns were combined with field artillery firing over open sites when necessary, infantry anti-tank teams positioned close to likely breach exits, and tank units held behind the forward belt for counterblows against stalled German armour. Intelligence and operational timing made the planning contest unusually explicit. Soviet headquarters anticipated a major German attack on the Kursk salient and used the months before July to expand defensive works and stockpile ammunition forward. German commanders, for their part, were aware that the Soviet defense would be prepared, but assessed that concentrated force and specialized engineer support could still rupture it. The decision to proceed, despite that expectation, reflected the broader strategic dilemma. Delaying further risked allowing Soviet strength to increase, while attacking risked expending irreplaceable armored and trained manpower resources in a battle the opponent had prepared for. These goals and constraints shaped what would happen at Poneri once the fight moved into the settlement itself. For the German side, the tactical objective became inseparable from logistics. Every additional mine belt, damaged bridge, or immobilized vehicle reduced the chance of maintaining tempo. For the Soviet side, the defense required discipline in withdrawing from exposed forward positions, rapid reoccupation of secondary lines, and willingness to commit reserves in small, repeated counterattacks designed to prevent a breach from becoming an operational opening. By the time Poneri became the focal point, both commands were already operating inside the logic their planning had created. Germany seeking a narrow breakthrough that demanded speed, the Soviet Union seeking a layered defense that made speed increasingly expensive. By the night of June 7th to 8th, the fighting north of Poneri had already changed the local force balance. The 81st Rifle Division, which had defended a 10-kilometer sector in the first belt, withdrew through the second belt positions around Poneri Station after losing 2,518 men from an original strength of about 8,000 in 2 days of combat, while reporting roughly 70 German tanks destroyed or disabled in that same period. The immediate implication for both commands was that the next German push would meet a reorganized defense anchored on Poneri itself, rather than on the outermost trench line. 13th Army of Lieutenant General N.P. Pukov responded by concentrating resources on a single tactical problem: preventing the German penetration from turning into usable maneuver space along the rail and road corridor. On the night of June 7th to July 7th, the 307th Rifle Division under Major General M.A. Yenshin became the primary holding formation for Poneri Station, reinforced by the 129th Tank Brigade, the 1,442nd Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment, additional artillery units, and mobile obstacle detachments. The division also received the fires of multiple mortar and guards, mortar formations, and substantial elements of the 5th Artillery Penetration Division. The documented gun allocation reached roughly 380 pieces in support of a single rifle division, described in Soviet records as the largest such defensive artillery concentration for one division on the Eastern Front. At daybreak on July 7th, the defense was organized in depth around identifiable approaches. The 1019 Rifle Regiment covered the direct route to Poneri Station and Pavaya Maya. The 1021 Rifle Regiment defended the approaches toward Hill 257.1 and Nikolskoye 2, and the 1023rd Rifle Regiment stood in second echelon near and east of Poneri, coordinated with the 129th Tank Brigade and obstacle units. Heavy tanks and anti-tank reserves were placed behind the forward regiments on terrain that allowed rapid commitment against a breach. The German assault on July 7th was prepared as a concentrated effort by XXXX Anhangs Panzer Corps. Soviet sources describe an assault grouping of about 200 tanks for the operation. After a short artillery and air preparation around 0630, 2 regiments of the 292nd Infantry Division advanced toward Poneri Station with roughly 100 tanks and self-propelled guns from the 18th Panzer Division on the left flank sector, facing the 1019th Rifle Regiment. Soviet defenders replied with massed rocket artillery fires, followed by air attacks, and then relied on the obstacle system that had been renewed overnight. Newly laid minefields disabled about 22 German tanks as the assault pressed into the breach lanes. The first engagements at Poneri therefore took the form of repeated short assaults rather than a single continuous surge. Over roughly 4 hours on July 7th, the 1019th Rifle Regiment repelled 4 separate attempts to break through its positions on the direct station approach, while other German elements probed for a flank opening toward the hills east of the settlement. As the morning progressed, the battle expanded from a penetration attempt into a fight for specific terrain keys. By mid-morning, the German 86th Infantry Division and 78th Assault Division entered the engagement area, and the main combat zone stretched from Poneri Station to Pavaya Maya. At 11:30, German tanks and infantry penetrated in the sector east of Pavaya Maya and seized Hill 257.1, a position that threatened nearby Soviet artillery and exposed portions of the 1021 Regiment's line. Fighting did not pause after dark. The struggle transitioned into fragmented close combat around buildings, embankments, and strongpoints, with local Soviet attempts to seal gaps failing to restore a continuous line. The night of July 7th to 8th became a contest of endurance and resupply under fire, as both sides tried to keep small bridgeheads inside the defensive system from turning into a wider rupture. On July 8th, even as German effort began shifting westward toward the Okhovatka direction, Poneri remained critical enough that 13th Army ordered counterattacks to retake the station area. Soviet forces partially regained ground in the station complex, including the water supply point, but did not clear German troops from the position. Through the night of July 7th to 8th, the fight around Poneri shifted from a penetration battle into a struggle over a few hundred meters of built-up terrain tied to the rail line. German assault groups remained inside the northern and central parts of the settlement, while Soviet defenders attempted to seal gaps with small counterattacks and obstacle detachments. Fires from mortars, field artillery, and direct fire guns were used at short ranges because lines of sight were limited by buildings, embankments, and smoke from ongoing fires in the village. On July 8th, German operational attention began to pull westward toward the Okhovatka direction, where German forces committed additional armoured strength, including the 4th Panzer Division, against Soviet positions controlling the high ground. At Poneri Station, however, the tactical situation remained unresolved. The Soviet 13th Army commander, Lieutenant General N.P. Pukhov, treated Poneri as a critical holding point whose loss would expose the second defensive belt to further exploitation, and he ordered renewed counterattacks aimed at restoring the station complex rather than simply containing German footholds. The Soviet response on July 8th was defined by reinforcement and fire concentration. Pukhov dispatched the 51st Tank Brigade and his anti-tank reserve to cooperate with the already engaged 129th Tank Brigade, while also transferring the 4th Guards Airborne Division to 29th Rifle Corps control, as a depth reserve positioned about 2 kilometers behind the main defensive line. A separate armoured train unit, the 49th Separate Battalion of Armoured Trains, moved into firing positions south of Poneri Station along the Kursk rail line, adding mobile direct fire to the defence of the corridor. These measures were intended to solve a practical problem: prevent German infantry and tanks from consolidating inside the station area long enough to widen the breach. Soviet counterattacks began in mid-morning on July 8th by elements of the 307th Rifle Division's 1019th and 1023rd Rifle Regiments, supported by the 51st and 129th Tank Brigades, the 27th Tank Regiment, and sustained artillery fire. The immediate tactical objective was not a broad advance, but the recapture of key points inside the station complex. By about 1300, repeated Soviet attacks forced German troops out of the southern portion of the station area and regained the water supply point, which then became a contested node for the rest of the day. German assaults at approximately 1800 retook the point, after which Soviet counterattacks, covered by tank destroyer regiment fires, halted further German movement. After nightfall, control shifted again as Soviet battalions re-entered the position. The pattern indicated that neither side could hold without constant reinforcement, and that localized successes did not translate into a stable front line. The escalation reached a crisis threshold on July 9th as German attacks increased in density and coordination. Soviet accounts describe Poneri defenders being subjected to continuous fires during the early hours, followed by renewed heavy assaults that swept over the village by mid-morning. By 1800, all 3 battalions of the 1023rd Rifle Regiment were surrounded in the central part of Poneri around the railroad station. The encirclement created an immediate operational risk for the Soviet defense. Losing the regiment in place would weaken the already depleted rifle division and open the station area to a wider German consolidation. The Soviet reaction used a narrow relief operation aligned to the terrain. At 1900 on 9 July, the 4th Guards Airborne Division attacked along the railroad with the explicit aim of breaking the encirclement. After several hours of fighting, its troops reached Poneri Station and the southern edge of WWII, restoring a corridor for withdrawal, resupply, and reinforcement. The episode reflected the logic of the Soviet defense in this sector. Rather than committing a large armoured counterstroke in open ground, the command repeatedly used infantry-heavy formations and concentrated fires to keep the battle confined and to deny the attacker a clean breakthrough line. At first light on July 10th, Soviet forces resumed assaults under concentrated German fires from tanks, artillery, mortars, and small arms, and encountered fresh German reinforcement identified as the 10th Panzergrenadier Division. German attacks forced elements of the airborne regiments to fall back and pinned remaining airborne units and the remnants of the 307th Rifle Division inside Poneri Station. After roughly 6 hours of fighting, the German assault tempo diminished, but the Soviet holding forces were increasingly exhausted and fragmented. By the evening of 10 to 11 July, Pukov ordered the remaining elements of the 307th Rifle Division to hand over positions to the 3rd and 4th Guards Airborne Divisions and withdraw to the rear, marking a transition from Rifle Division defense to airborne formations sustaining the line under continuing pressure. By 11 July, the battle around Poneri had reached a phase where the distinction between village and defensive position no longer mattered. The station complex, rail embankments, nearby heights, and the remains of buildings had become a connected combat zone defined by short lines of sight and constant fire. The tactical pattern was no longer a single assault and a single defense, but a cycle, artillery and mortars to suppress, infantry to enter or clear a block of ground, armour and assault guns to support at close range, then immediate counterattacks to reverse any local penetration before it could be widened. For the German Ninth Army, the peak problem was operational timing. The northern pincer depended on rapid progression through the defensive belts toward the Olkovatka line. Instead, the fighting around Poneri imposed repeated pauses. Lanes had to be reopened, immobilized vehicles recovered or abandoned, and infantry reorganized after close-quarter engagements that consumed ammunition and leaders at platoon and company level. German commanders reinforced the assault with fresh infantry and armoured support, but the effect increasingly became local reinforcement to sustain pressure, not an opening for manoeuvre. For Central Front and 13th Army, the peak problem was endurance under a fixed requirement. The front could bend, but the rail and road corridor could not be allowed to become a breakthrough route. After the 307th Rifle Division's period of continuous fighting, the line in the Poneri sector was increasingly carried by the 3rd and 4th Guards Airborne Divisions, supported by tank brigades, anti-tank reserves, and an unusually dense artillery grouping. The purpose of the airborne formations here was not airborne operations, but disciplined infantry defense and rapid counterattack capability in a terrain where the attacker's armor could not fully exploit. On the ground, the most intense fighting centered on the same decisive points that had emerged earlier: the station area, adjacent strongpoints along the embankment, and approaches to the higher ground that controlled observation and artillery adjustment. German assault groups attempted to clear these nodes to create a stable base for continued southward advance. Soviet units attempted to keep those nodes contested so the attacker could not shift from assault to consolidation. This produced a measurable operational consequence: Even where German troops entered parts of Poneri, they were forced to fight again for the same yards, because the defence was organised to reappear behind the penetration with fresh firing positions and pre-registered artillery. The air and artillery dimension reinforced this confinement. German air support and artillery fires aimed to isolate the station area and suppress Soviet anti-tank guns and mortar positions. Soviet artillery, including rocket mortars, focused on breach lanes, assembly areas, and the immediate vicinity of any captured buildings or embankment segments where German infantry clustered. In practice, this meant that both sides often fought for a position that could not be held quietly. Any concentration quickly drew fire, and any movement that tried to widen a foothold risked entering pre-planned kill zones. Civilian impact, where civilians remained, was inseparable from the tactical situation. The settlement and surrounding farms were progressively destroyed by shellfire and fire, and any remaining non-combatants faced displacement, loss of shelter, and the hazards of an environment where front lines moved through streets and courtyards multiple times within a day. For soldiers on both sides, the battle reduced to functional tasks under constant fatigue, moving ammunition forward across open gaps, evacuating wounded through disrupted routes, and restoring communications after repeated breaks. By 12th July, the peak intensity around Poneri coincided with a broader shift in the operational picture. The German northern offensive had not achieved the depth required to break into open maneuver space toward Kursk. At the same time, Soviet operations elsewhere began to impose new pressures on German command priorities, reducing the feasibility of continuing costly assaults that had not produced a decisive breach. In the Poneri sector, this translated into a gradual transition from repeated large assaults to more limited attacks and fire exchanges, with both sides consolidating what they could hold. The outcome at Poneri was therefore not a single dramatic collapse or breakthrough, but a cumulative denial. The defence, reinforced and reorganised under pressure, prevented the northern pincer from converting early penetrations into an operational decision. After 10 July, the Poneri sector became a laboratory of rapid adaptation rather than a single continuous assault. Both sides were operating inside a compressed battle space where gains were measured in buildings, embankment segments, and short stretches of trench, and where each side's ability to learn and adjust inside a 24-hour cycle mattered as much as the number of tanks present. German units increasingly relied on small, combined arms assault groupings rather than broad armoured movement. Infantry squads and pioneer detachments were used to probe for gaps, clear mines and wire, and enter the built-up strongpoints under cover of short artillery concentrations. Armour and assault guns were then brought forward not to exploit into depth, but to deliver direct fire against identified firing points, often from hull-down positions along field edges or behind embankments. Where mines and obstacles repeatedly stalled movement, German commanders adapted by shifting effort to adjacent approaches, attempting to bypass the most heavily mined lanes rather than forcing a single corridor open again and again. This was also a form of resource management. Each halted vehicle meant recovery assets and time, and the accumulated mechanical and mine losses reduced the ability to sustain pressure. Soviet defense in Poneri adapted by tightening the relationship between obstacles, anti-tank fire, and immediate counterattack forces. The defensive method became less about holding a continuous front line and more about maintaining a set of contested nodes that prevented consolidation. Engineers and obstacle detachments renewed minefields and blocked newly created lanes during darkness and lulls, aiming to ensure that any German daytime advance still had to pass through predictable exits. Anti-tank guns were repositioned repeatedly to cover those exits, and artillery fire plans were adjusted to strike likely German assembly points the moment a foothold formed. This layered approach reduced the defenders' dependence on a single regiment or a single trench. If one position was lost, the next position was already tied into pre-planned fires. The substitution of depleted rifle units with Guards airborne divisions in the sector was itself an adaptation to the nature of the fight. These formations were used as disciplined infantry in a defensive role, capable of rapid local counterattacks and organized withdrawals under heavy fire. Their presence helped sustain coherence when earlier units had been worn down by continuous close combat. And it also gave the Soviet command a tool to restore the line without committing large armoured forces into narrow, mined and heavily observed approaches. Both sides improvised under the logistical realities of the battlefield. Ammunition supply became a daily constraint. Mortars and artillery could deliver decisive effects, but only if shells could be moved forward along routes under fire. Medical evacuation and replacement of junior leaders affected combat effectiveness directly, because repeated assaults and counter-assaults produced leadership losses at platoon and company level. Maintenance and recovery shaped the armoured balance in practice. Vehicles disabled by mines or mechanical failure might remain on the field for hours, becoming either obstacles or targets, and each side's ability to repair, tow, or salvage equipment influenced how much armour was actually available for the next day's fighting. Adaptation also had a psychological dimension. For German assault troops, repeated entry into the same contested zone without a stable consolidation phase increased fatigue and reduced the predictability of command and control. For Soviet defenders, the requirement to counterattack into rubble and smoke demanded unit discipline because the tactical goal was often limited and immediate: recover a firing point, seal a gap, or prevent an enemy foothold from becoming a strong point. Morale on both sides was therefore tied to functional indicators rather than abstract objectives. Whether ammunition arrived, whether wounded could be evacuated, whether communications held, and whether a counterattack achieved a concrete local result. By the end of this phase, Poneri's significance was less about a single capture or defense of the station, and more about what the fighting demonstrated operationally. The German Northern Offensive was forced into a pattern of repeated tactical problem-solving inside a fortified zone, consuming time and combat power without producing maneuver space. The Soviet defense, despite high attrition in frontline units, proved able to reconstitute a coherent line by rotating formations, renewing obstacles, and keeping the key nodes contested. This ability to resist and adapt under pressure set the conditions for the next shift. When the broader operational momentum changed, the Poneri sector did not offer the attacker a ready-made corridor forward, but a battlefield still structured to deny rapid advance. On July 12, 1943, the fight around Poneri reached a turning point not because one side achieved a clear tactical capture of the station area, but because the wider operational setting changed in a way that removed the logic of continued German assaults there. By that date, Model's 9th Army had fought through the outer belts of Central Front's defences, but had not obtained the depth needed to reach the operational objectives south of the Poneri-Olkovatka line. Contemporary operational summaries and later studies generally describe the northern penetration as limited in depth, on the order of roughly 10 to 15 kilometres in the main thrust zones, with advances repeatedly slowed by mine belts, artillery fire, and the requirement to reduce fortified nodes rather than bypass them. The immediate tactical situation at Poneri remained a contested defensive knot. German assault groupings could still enter or hold portions of the built-up area, but consolidating those gains into a stable corridor proved difficult because Soviet forces retained adjacent strongpoints, maintained artillery coverage on likely assembly points, and used counterattacks to force repeated recapture of the same ground. This denied the German side the transition from assault to exploitation that their planning required. The Northern Pincer's timetable depended on creating maneuver space for armoured units. Poneri instead demanded continuous infantry engineer effort and repeated close support, consuming combat power without producing an operational opening. The larger shift began the same day to the north of the Kursk salient. On July 12th, the Soviet summer counteroffensive against the Oral salient opened under the codename Operation Kutuzov, aimed at German forces holding the bulge around Orel. This created an immediate threat to the rear and flanks of the German formations conducting Citadel's northern assault. For 9th Army headquarters, the problem became one of risk management, continuing costly attacks toward Kursk, while Soviet forces attacked the Oral position, increased the chance that German forward units could be forced to break off under pressure, with a reduced freedom to withdraw and regroup. As this pressure developed, German decisions around Poneri became increasingly shaped by operational necessity rather than local tactical opportunity. The choice was not simply whether a few blocks of the station complex could be held, but whether the northern offensive still served a realistic operational purpose when the broader front required defensive reinforcement. The German command began to shift from seeking incremental forward gains to limiting exposure, preserving remaining armoured and engineer assets, and preparing for an orderly transition to defence. The termination of Operation Citadel followed shortly afterward, with German forces in the Kursk sector increasingly required elsewhere, and the northern effort unable to deliver the breakthrough that would justify further expenditure. For the Soviet side, the turning point validated the defensive method employed around Poneri. Even after heavy attrition among early holding divisions, Central Front could maintain a coherent line by rotating formations, renewing obstacles, and keeping key terrain nodes contested long enough for the strategic initiative to change. The essential effect was cumulative. Poneri did not need to be held in the sense of an unbroken front edge. It needed to deny the attacker a stable, widened breach corridor, long enough for Soviet offensive operations to shift German priorities. This is the point where the comparison with the southern sector becomes analytically important. On July 12th, the best-known armoured battle of the Kursk campaign occurred near Prokhorovka, but the northern sector's outcome imposed a structural limit on the entire Citadel concept. If the northern pincer could not break into operational depth, the planned encirclement could not be completed regardless of events in the south. In that sense, the failure to convert the Poneri battle zone into a manoeuvre corridor contributed directly to the moment when the German offensive ceased to be a viable operational solution and became a problem of how to disengage under growing Soviet pressure. By the evening of the 11th of July, 13th Army treated the Poneri fight as a completed defensive task rather than an ongoing attempt to restore a continuous front line inside the settlement. Pukov ordered the remaining elements of the 307th Rifle Division to hand over their positions to the 3rd and 4th Guards Airborne Divisions and withdraw to the rear. In the same assessment, Soviet staff concluded that the 9th Army's prospects for success in the 13th Army sector had ended, even though German attacks continued in adjacent areas. This transition was followed immediately by a shift in the operational environment that narrowed German options. On July 12th, Soviet forces opened Operation Kutuzov against the Oral salient, threatening the flank and rear of Model's 9th Army while Citadel was still underway. The German response required rapid redistribution of mobile formations. Units previously intended to sustain the northern offensive were reassigned to meet Soviet penetrations, and the northern thrust toward Kursk lost the ability to regenerate momentum through fresh armoured commitment. In practice, disengagement began as a logistical and command problem rather than a single withdrawal order. German forward elements around Poneri had to maintain contact long enough to extract damaged vehicles, reposition artillery, and keep road junctions open for rearward movement under Soviet fire. Soviet forces, for their part, attempted to convert the end of German forward pressure into incremental advances, but their approach emphasized maintaining defensive coherence while the broader front situation clarified. The Poneri sector therefore moved from repeated assaults and counter-assaults into positional fighting and controlled pullbacks, with the front lines stabilizing closer to the pre-Citadel belt system than German planning had anticipated. As Kutuzov expanded, the northern Kursk battlefield became part of a larger retreat sequence tied to the Oral Bulge. The Soviet offensive, 12th July to 18th August, was conducted by multiple fronts and fielded forces on a scale substantially larger than the local Poneri sector. Published strength estimates commonly describe roughly 300,700 German troops, with about 625 tanks and assault guns, versus roughly 800,000 Soviet troops, with about 2,409 tanks and assault guns, with corresponding casualty estimates on the order of 86,454 German and 429,890 Soviet, killed, wounded, missing, or sick, depending on accounting methods and scope. For Ninth Army, the immediate consequence was the loss of operational freedom. Soviet breakthroughs north of the Kursk salient compelled German commanders to shorten their forward exposure. Accounts of Kutuzov describe Ninth Army falling back to its starting positions by 18th July, and later, as pressure persisted, withdrawing from the Oral Bulge toward the prepared Hagen position east of Bryansk. The city of Oral was taken by Soviet forces on 5th of August 1943 during this sequence, marking the end of the salient as a German operational base. At ground level, around Poneri, the aftermath was defined by depletion and reconstruction of combat power. Soviet rifle formations that had carried the first week were reorganized, replenished, and reattached as the front shifted westward. German units faced the same need, while also covering a widening defensive problem around Oral. The immediate civilian consequences in the Poneri area were material: extensive destruction of housing, rail facilities, and farm infrastructure in a zone repeatedly contested at short range, followed by a rapid transition to repair priorities focused on roads, rail movement, and restoring basic shelter behind the advancing Soviet front. The post-war memory of Kursk developed around images and narratives that were easier to compress into a single, dramatic moment. The southern sector offered a concentrated, visually legible story: large, armoured formations colliding on open ground near a named point that could be photographed, mapped, and retold as a single day of tank combat. The northern sector, and Poneri in particular, produced a different kind of evidence. Its decisive mechanisms were obstacles: artillery concentration, short-range fights over strong points, and repeated localized counterattacks that prevented consolidation. That pattern is harder to summarize as one iconic scene, even when its operational effect was direct. This difference in narrative convenience influenced both contemporary reporting and later historiography. Wartime communiques and early official histories often emphasized events that could be framed as a clear clash of armor, while the grinding defensive battles of the north were distributed across days, villages, and unnamed field positions. German memoir literature also tended to privilege armored maneuver and the experience of panzer formations, which again elevated southern set pieces over infantry engineer attrition fights inside fortified settlements. Poneri, by contrast, is best understood through staff reports, artillery logs, engineer records, and detailed tactical maps, rather than through a single battlefield panorama. Poneri's historical significance becomes clearer when it is evaluated by operational outcomes instead of spectacle. The northern pincer was the half of Citadel that had to reach depth rapidly enough to keep the overall concept viable. Around Poneri, the German attack repeatedly failed to convert penetration into exploitation. The Soviet defense did not depend on holding an unbroken front edge. It depended on denying a stable corridor. That denial imposed a time cost that could not be recovered because each additional day of close combat consumed engineer capacity, recovery assets, ammunition stocks, and trained infantry leaders at lower levels. When the broader Soviet summer offensives began, German command attention and mobile reserves were pulled away. The northern attack did not end with a single catastrophic loss. It ended because the conditions for continuing it ceased to exist. This is also why casualty debates matter at Poneri, but in a specific way. The most important question is not a single tally, because accounting methods differ and the boundaries of the Poneri battle are defined differently in Soviet and German records. The analytically useful issue is the exchange mechanism. Mines and obstacles created predictable lanes, artillery massed on those lanes, anti-tank fires were layered, and immediate counterattacks prevented the attacker from reorganizing inside captured ground. Even where the attacker gained buildings or embankment segments, the inability to consolidate forced repeated re-entry into the same fire plan. The result was a pattern where tactical gains did not accumulate into operational depth. Poneri also illustrates a broader development in Soviet operational art by mid-1943. Defense was no longer treated as a temporary pause before attack, but as a planned operation in its own right, with belts, reserves, and artillery control designed to shape the battle. The use of replacement formations to sustain coherence in the line and the integration of engineers and obstacle detachments into daily battle rhythm show a system that could absorb attrition while preserving the ability to transition to offensive action. German doctrine still sought rapid decision through concentrated thrust, but Poneri demonstrates how a prepared defense could force that thrust into a series of costly tactical problems without offering maneuver space in return. The question of whether Poneri was more decisive than Prokhorovka depends on the definition of decisive. If decisive means a single concentrated armoured encounter with a clear geographic label, Prokhorovka fits that template. If decisive means denying the operational premise of Citadel by preventing the northern pincer from reaching depth, Poneri becomes central to explaining why the offensive failed to produce its intended strategic effect. A full reconstruction of Kursk requires both: the south to explain the limits of German armoured advance under Soviet reserve commitment, and the north to explain how prepared defences could stall an attack before it reached the kind of battlefield where dramatic armoured manoeuvre was even possible. In that sense, Poneri's legacy is methodological. It shifts attention from counting tanks at a single point to analysing how terrain, obstacles, artillery control, and reserve timing determine whether tactical success can be translated into operational decision. It also explains why the northern battlefield is less present in popular memory. It is a story told in schedules, supply rates, minefield densities, and the repeated reoccupation of the same strongpoints. Those are not secondary details. At Poneri, they were the mechanism that stopped the northern offensive and helped set the conditions for the Soviet shift to sustained summer offensives that followed.